So what did we learn on Isla? I think the biggest thing we learned is that the scotch that was being made 100 years ago bears almost no resemblance to what's being sold today. Back then, they would just make this from leftover grains. They would drink it straight off the still. It's clear, it's unaged, it's not sweet and complex and delicious. It's just something to get you hammered through the long winter, I think. So uh, it was cool to see the history of it, but also it demystified things a little bit for me. I feel like we get a little bit of a biased picture in the U.S. about how European things are old and good and have this long history, and sort of New World things like tequila don't nearly get nearly as much respect. But both of those spirits, for example, tequila and whiskey, are completely dependent on the American bourbon industry. They have these crazy rules in Kentucky about barrels only being able to be used once, and there's a huge secondary market for those barrels, which is what tequila is aged in. It's what whiskey is aged in. It's what a bunch of gin is actually being aged in now, specialty gin, and many of these are first fillings and second fillings of these used casks. So that surprised me. I didn't, we think of New World spirits like bourbon sort of being second fiddle in some ways to these older things, but in reality, one greatly influenced the other and is completely dependent on it. So that was surprising to me. I also didn't understand that the sort of rich, moneyed golf playing single malt thing that we know today is a relatively recent invention. In the 80s, most of these distilleries were in financial hardship when, for example, Port Ellen got bought out. They bought it just to get the casks out of the warehouse, and they demolished the building. So Port Ellen Distillery is just gone. Ardbeg was similar. They managed to save the distillery, but it was bought by, I think, Diageo, a huge international conglomerate, to essentially get their hands on all those old casks. Because you think, if you're selling a whiskey, or you're going to try to sell one for a ton of money, it's going to need to have some papers to go with it, and they're going to want it to be old. So it's very difficult to predict what your market's going to be 15 years from now when you start putting things away. So they wanted to get their hands on those casks, and it was just by sheer luck that they were able to save the distillery and keep making it. So that was sort of surprising to me. It's hard for me to grasp the idea that these beautiful, smoky, peaty things were largely in the 70s just cranking out peaty notes for blended whiskeys. So you might be making some big blended Canadian whiskey, and you might need a tiny, tiny bit of this smoky note in there. And to think that places like Caol Ila were just manufacturing these little scent notes, taste notes that were being dropped into large industrial-sized vats of blended whiskey, it seems unthinkable. And so we were really surprised to hear that as well. You could definitely get a sense from people that there was ambivalent, I don't know, complicated relationship with these bigger companies that have bought them out. For example, Suntory, the Japanese whiskey company, bought out Jim Beam, and they own some of the distilleries. Diageo owns some, and LVMH owns, Louis Vuitton owns some of them. And you can tell it's complex because they essentially, with their luxury powerhouse marketing clout, went out and sort of created this market where idiots like me will pay $100 for a bottle of whiskey that was being sold at auction or dumped into blends 20 years ago. And I don't know that those small distilleries could have achieved that without this international powerhouse sort of reaching out to their rich douchebag customers and convincing them this is a thing they should drink. It was just interesting to see how people were kind of excited, but also a little bit about it all being owned by other people. There's one distillery left on the island that's independent, and that's called Kilchoman. They do an interesting thing where they make a special release that's entirely from grain that's grown on Islay. Most of the grain for the other whiskeys comes from mainland Scotland, and some of the other brands, you could tell they were being a little shady towards them, bring in stuff from Spain, grain from Spain and from France and from various other places. But Kilchoman does a special release so you can sort of taste the terroir of this grain. We bought some. It's quite good. It's nice and balanced. It's still got that smoky note, but it's much more even-handed, kind of like Lagavulin is. I was surprised also that they use just river water. It's just, we think of beer and it's so clean and the water source is so important. And here, yes, they're mandated by law or regulation to have their own water supply, but at the same time, it's just brown water coming into the thing. So we were shocked, and the tour guy was like, "Well, it's distilled. I mean, you're literally, so it doesn't matter." I just imagine being a very dirty tank at the end. I don't know. That's not really my problem, I guess. Another cool thing we saw was that these fermentation tanks are made of wood, and I guess they're very tall, and so the only pieces, like these long strips of wood, the only place they can get them is from forests in Oregon, which is where I'm from. So it's kind of cool to see these trees that come from my homeland to come here and help make this whiskey, that was kind of cool. Another thing we learned was that there's a zillion new boutique whiskey distilleries opening across Ireland and in parts of Scotland. Not so much on Islay, but everywhere else. And by law, whiskey has to be at least 3 years and a day old before it can be called whiskey. So they're saying that in 3 to 5 plus years, we should see sort of an explosion of micro distilleries across that part of the world. And it's happening elsewhere too, but I mean, this is just from there. So we should see a lot of interesting, weird things happening. I even saw with my own eyes someone who was doing a quinoa whiskey, which seems like, why? But if you're going up against the likes of Diageo and Louis Vuitton in terms of marketing, you have to do something that can grab their attention or grab the drinker's attention away from the ridiculous marketing that's happening for the competing products. So I guess we're going to see a lot of gimmicks thrown against the wall, and we'll see what sticks. I'm excited though. Anything to sort of check out. New creativity in that space is something that's very welcome. Another thing we learned was about the peat itself. Other whiskies from other islands and other parts of Scotland are also peated, but their peat comes from sort of different sources, more heather, more flowers, more sort of planty things, whereas on Islay, the peat is all sort of coming off of a plain that's right next to the ocean. So it's saltier, or briny, or seaweedy, and it gives it a very unique taste, even amongst other peated whiskeys. We didn't unfortunately get a chance to see the actual peating process taking place because, as I mentioned in the post, the distillery has maintenance time. When you go in August, you're maybe going to get a little bit of sun, but you're also likely going to be there for various shutdowns due to the water supplies. So we didn't get to see any peating. We got to see the grains being dried and sprouted on the floor, which just comes right before that stage, but we didn't get to actually see the peating. But they have this very unique peat, which is a resource that's only being replenished at like a millimeter a year or something. So they're very carefully monitoring their use of it so they don't end up, running out. I think with climate change, there are probably other things that will cause that to happen before they burn up all of the peat. But it is really cool because the Port Ellen Maltings they're doing everyone's grains essentially except like 2 of them, and this thing is spewing out this beautiful smelling peat smell, just sort of covering the island, and it's like the best campfire in the world smell. So it's really nice, just walking around and smelling that in the ocean and everything. So yeah, I think that's about all I have to say. So I'll post this, and if I think of something else, I'll just write it at the end. Bye.